the curious tale of medieval Icelandic ghost beliefs. Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into the chill and slightly damp realm of Iceland's medieval ghost beliefs. A landscape so foggy, rocky, and isolated that you'd swear every boulder has a spirit lurking underneath. You stand on the wind-battered edge of a black sand beach, the North Atlantic snarling just out of reach, salt spray stinging your face. The mossy hills behind you conceal ancient turf houses and burial mounds. Yes, the same ones where folks swear the dead still mutter secrets to passing sheep. And honestly, you probably won't survive this stroll through the haunted fjords, unless you keep your wits about you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Are you listening from a cozy apartment or a creaky old farmhouse? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your boots sink into soft turf as you trudge toward a place locals once avoided after dusk. Imagine it. Medieval Iceland, sparsely settled, no streetlights, just sheep, volcanic crags, and stories whispering on the wind. They said the fjords held spirits that drifted across the water at twilight, searching for warmth among the living. One mainstream fact: Icelanders truly believed the boundary between living and dead was thin enough for visits. Unlike most medieval European Christians, they didn't fully trust that the churchyard fence kept souls penned in. Take a breath. Can you smell the salty brine mixed with the scent of wet moss? It's here, beside these icy inlets, that fishermen swore they glimpsed pale shapes drifting just beyond the breakers. Some tales claim these shapes were restless sailors lost to sudden storms. Others say they were spirits of settlers who never made peace with the harsh land. Historians still argue whether these ghost tales were more about explaining deadly accidents or scaring children into obedience. A quirky twist for you. Not all these spirits were human. Some ghost stories speak of seals, yes, seals who shed their skins by moonlight to become ghostly figures dancing on the beaches. Locals called them selkies or finfolk, creatures who blurred the line between folklore and ghost lore, showing how Iceland's isolation brewed strange hybrids of belief. You stumble over a patch of sharp volcanic rock, boots scraping flint on flint, echoing through the mist. That sound might make you jump, but don't worry. According to some tales, the dead dislike iron and steel. A good sturdy knife was as useful for fighting off wandering spirits as it was for cutting dried cod. A quick modern aside. Today, you can still find old turf homes dotting the coastline, some rumored to be haunted by original occupants who peek through turf roofs like mossy eyebrows. Ever booked an Airbnb and wondered if your host forgot to mention the ghost tax? You press on, the sea breeze growing colder as it slides down from the Arctic. Icelanders once believed the fjord's deep waters hid more than fish. Some even swore that on still nights, you could hear faint singing beneath the wave songs of the drowned, trying to lure the living closer. It sounds romantic until you imagine slipping into those freezing depths wearing nothing but a wool tunic. But don't worry, you have your modern blanket. Wrap it tighter. The spirits here rarely bother those who respect the land. Back then, every farm had its rituals. A small stone placed at the edge of a field, a whispered thanks to the departed for good weather, or a bowl of broth left for ancestors to sip invisibly. It was all about balance. Appease the dead, and they'd protect you. Annoy them, and you might lose a sheep or three to the cliffs. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the hush of waves mingling with phantom voices. The fjords cradle these stories like deep pockets, holding centuries of superstition in every crashing tide. The next time you stand on a cold shore somewhere, maybe remember that once people believed they weren't alone, no matter how far from the nearest neighbor they might be. As you step away from the shore, you might feel that odd tingle down your neck. Don't look back too quickly. They say the best way to keep a ghost calm is to pretend you never saw it. And maybe, just maybe, these haunted fjords are content to stay just stories after all. You trudge inland now, boots squelching through a patch of boggy ground, where the mist thickens and the world seems to shrink down to your heartbeat, and the drip-drip of cold water off your hood. You've left the fjord behind, but you can still taste its salt on your lips, a ghost of the sea itself, perhaps, clinging to your thoughts as you stumble onto furrow turf near an old, half-collapsed turf house. This ruin isn't much to look at. Slumped roof, mossy stones, a door hanging on by one rusty hinge. But this is exactly the sort of place medieval Icelanders said you'd hear the dead talk. See, in those long nights when the sun dipped below the horizon for months on end, people claimed corpses could stir in their graves and speak. And not just mumble nonsense. They'd deliver warnings, predictions, or sometimes demand a favor be done to let them rest properly. The mainstream fact is, unlike many European Christian communities who leaned heavily on priests to bless away trouble, Icelandic farmers relied more on old family customs, runes, and whispered deals with the deceased. Historians still argue whether these talking corpses were born from genuine sightings or just a good excuse to explain bad dreams, lost livestock, or the creeping dread that came from spending too much time alone with your own thoughts. Isolation can do strange things to your mind. After all, especially when your nearest neighbor might be 3 frozen valleys away. Step into the turf house, duck your head, or you'll catch it on the low timber beam. You smell stale earth and damp wool. There's an old bed frame, straw mattress gone to mold, and a small stone hearth where a fire once glowed warm enough to hold back the dark. Imagine lying here, wrapped in fur, and hearing your late uncle's voice from just beyond the door. He's dead, yes, buried out back, feet pointed east so he'll rise on Judgment Day. But still, he wants to remind you about that debt you owe, or that fence you promised to mend. Quirky fact, sometimes Icelanders believed the dead needed to chat, not just to pass on news, but to ask for help. Maybe their grave was too shallow, or a neighbor's sheep trampled the burial mound. These small insults could wake the dead, just enough to rustle that turf roof and whisper your name on the wind. You lean closer to the cold hearth, listening. For a moment, the wind rattles the door, and you swear you catch a word in the swirl of air. Of course, it's probably just the breeze, or maybe the house settling. But imagine if you were half asleep, half starved, and half sure that the afterlife was only a stone's throw away. Back then, the line between dream and haunting was deliciously thin. Modern folk might smile at this, but think about it. Today, we have phones pinging us awake at 3 a.m. with the latest bad news. Back then, your version of a late-night text alert was a dead cousin tapping on your window to tell you where he left a buried chest of silver. Historians still debate whether these stories sprang from real grief, wishful thinking, or clever ways to keep family secrets alive long after the body went cold. You step back outside, pulling your coat tighter against the creeping chill. The sky is so low, it feels like you could reach up and brush your fingertips through the clouds. Out here, every sound seems louder. The creak of old wood, the sigh of grass bowing under the wind, the distant bleat of a lone sheep who probably knows more ghost stories than you do. Some families even built special stones, speaking stones, where they sit to talk to their ancestors. No churches involved, just you, your family plot, and a lichen-spotted rock that serve as both confessional and family hotline. In some sagas, the dead got so chatty that living folk had to politely ask them to hush or risk the neighbors gossiping. A light joke for you. If you think your family group chat is relentless, now imagine a medieval. Icelandic one except instead of emoji and memes. You get a cold breeze under your blanket and a stern voice telling you to fix the barn roof. So you stand there, breath puffing in the cold, half wondering what you'd do if a voice joined you right now. Maybe it'd just remind you to close the door tight against the weather. Or maybe just maybe to tell you to keep listening, because the dead still have a lot to say in this land of lonely hills and endless winter nights. You step away from the leaning turf house and follow a faint trail deeper into the folds of the hillside. The ground rises in gentle humps, as if the earth itself were sleeping under a thick blanket of moss and low brambles. Somewhere in this rough grazing land, the bleat of a sheep breaks the hush a living one, or so you hope. Because out here, not every animal you spot in the half-light is exactly alive. One mainstream fact about medieval Iceland: sheep were absolutely everything. Meat, wool, milk, tiny, fluffy survival machines in a place where crops struggled and fish could vanish with a single storm. So naturally, people spun tales about them too. It wasn't enough to fear a ghostly uncle waking you up sometimes. You had to watch out for ghost sheep drifting through the fog, their soft back carrying messages from the beyond. You squint through the swirling mist, and they're a pale shape on the slope ahead. It lifts its head, stares right through you, then melts behind a boulder slick with lichen. Historians still argue whether ghost sheep stories were just fancy metaphors for lost flocks, or if they masked older pagan beliefs about animal spirits guarding the land. Some even think these sheep were linked to trolls, yes, the big rocky kind that, according to folklore, still lurk under stones when the sun sets. A fringe belief. In certain valleys, folks claim trolls could herd ghost sheep as decoys. Imagine that an invisible shepherd sending phantom mutton to lead your real flock astray, all because you forgot to leave a crust of bread by the hearth as an offering. Some farmers would swear by it, especially when a whole flock vanished overnight in a blizzard that no one saw coming. Your boots crunch on gravel as you cross a narrow stream trickling down from the high moors. The water is ice cold against your fingertips. When you pause to scoop some up crystal clear, it carries the taste of old glaciers. And perhaps, if you listen hard enough, a whisper from something older than glaciers too. Maybe that shape you saw wasn't a sheep at all. Maybe it was a ghostly trick of a troll, teasing you for your modern skepticism. Funny thing is, even today, Iceland has strict building codes to protect so-called hidden people, the Huldafolk, who are cousins of these trolls in local lore. Whole roads have been rerouted to avoid disturbing supposed elf stones where mischief makers dwell. Modern contractors argue about permits. Medieval farmers argued about missing sheep that might never have been real to begin with. You climb a small rise and stand there, catching your breath, looking back over the sweep of the land. It's easy to see how these stories grew legs and wool. Long, dark winters, herders sleeping rough with only their dogs, and the hiss of wind for company. Your mind would conjure anything to keep itself entertained. Or maybe to explain why the count was always one lamb, short come spring. A light joke for you to pocket next time you meet an Icelander. Ask if they've ever lost a sheep to a ghost troll. They'll laugh then, they'll probably check the weather, because the old fears slip so easily into the new world. The mist shifts, and suddenly that boulder you're leaning on doesn't look quite so still anymore. Maybe it's just a rock, or maybe it's a troll trying very hard not to breathe until you wander off. You walk on, boots scraping over loose stones, breath steaming in the cold air. The sky above you clears just enough for a streak of moonlight to find the ground, a silver path leading you past more low humps and lumps, each one a perfect hiding place for ghost sheep or a troll with a sheep's voice or something. Older still that doesn't care if you understand its ways. Historians still puzzle over the exact tangle of old Norse pagan roots and Christian fear that shaped these beliefs. Were trolls once protective spirits turned wicked by monks' sermons? Or were ghost sheep simply metaphors for hard times, when your livelihood could vanish overnight like a cloud drifting over the hills? You take one last look over your shoulder, just for fun, just to be sure that the pale shape isn't standing there again, watching you go, hooves hovering an inch above the grass. Better not to stare too long, ghost sheep. Don't like being counted. And neither, for that matter, do trolls. You pick your way down from the ridge, feeling the ground soften under your boots as you leave the rocky slopes behind. A thin path curls between scraggly birch trees and knee-high bush, guiding you toward the cluster of turf houses where families once huddled close during endless winter nights. You imagine ducking through a low wooden door, shaking off the chill, and stepping into the glow of a hearth where stories about the dead weren't just gossip, they were family business. In medieval Iceland, the dead weren't strangers drifting in from the fjords. Often, they were family parents, grandparents, siblings who, if you were lucky, turned up in your dreams with gentle advice or a quiet warning. One mainstream fact is that Icelandic sagas and folk beliefs are full of these so-called dream visitations, where a relative slips through the veil to whisper secrets only the bloodline should know. You push open the imaginary door and crouch by the fire. The walls are packed with moss and earth, shutting out the wind. A thin stream of smoke curls up through a hole in the roof, carrying the scent of peat and charred fish. You curl deeper into your sheepskin cloak, eyelids drooping as the crackle of flame mixes with the soft murmur of your kin living and dead alike. Quirky tidbit: Icelanders sometimes trusted the word of a dead ancestor more than the village law speaker. If your great-grandfather showed up in a dream, telling you where he buried a lost treasure or who really stole your best horse, well, you'd better listen. Some families even shared tales of old relatives nagging them for decades like ghostly parents who wouldn't. Stop reminding you to repair that leaking sod roof or patch the sheepfold gate. Historians still argue whether these family ghosts were comforting symbols in a harsh world or ways to justify decisions no one wanted to admit making. The ghost told me was a handy excuse for digging up a neighbor, sfield to find a chest of silver, or for accusing someone of theft when evidence was thin as summer hay. Imagine lying on a straw mattress under a hide blanket, staring at the flickering shadows on a turf wall. You hear the floorboards creak. There's no one there, of course, but you can't quite shake the thought that if you opened your eyes just wide enough, you'd see Aunt Gudrun standing by the hearth, knitting ghostly socks and mumbling about your chores. Some folks even welcomed these visits. A dead mother might appear at a child's bedside, smoothing a fevered brow or leaving a small sign, a warm spot on the blanket, a faint smell of the herbs she once used in the kitchen. Ghosts could scold too. Forget to feed the animals before dusk? Don't you be surprised if your late father sighs loudly enough in the rafters to make you stumble out of bed and pull on your boots. You step outside again, breath misting in the night air. The wind carries the scent of the sea up the valley, mixing with the earthy perfume of turf and sheep. Somewhere behind you, a door thuds shut, a real one or a ghost's, who can say? It's easy to believe that in a land so lonely, family ties stretched both ways across the grave. And not all ghosts were polite. Sometimes a relative brought warnings no one wanted to hear. Plagues, storms, famine. A dream ghost might appear at your bedside, voice hoarse with the chill of the grave, telling you to stock extra dried fish or patch your roof before the first winter gale. Ignore it, and you risked both ruin and gossip. After all, if a ghost gave you fair warning and you did nothing well, whose fault was that? Modern Icelanders still love a good family ghost story. Plenty of old farmhouses claim to host a kindly grandmother who rattles pots at night, or an uncle whose pipe smoke drifts through closed rooms. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it is just creaking old timber and drifting drafts. But it makes you wonder who is still watching when you settle into bed and the wind scratches the window. So you stand there now, listening to the hush of the valley. If you're very still, maybe you'll catch a whisper in the grass, an old voice reminding you not to leave the door open, not to waste the lamp oil, not to speak ill of the dead. After all, in Iceland, family never really leaves. They just wait until you're dozing, then slip back in, soft as frost on a sheep's back. You step away from the cluster of turf houses, boots sinking into the soft, spongy ground as you follow a narrow track winding toward a low rise. Up ahead, you see what looks like a series of small grassy humps scattered across the hillside burial mounds, silent witnesses to centuries of whispering winds and half-forgotten tales. If you listen carefully, you might swear you hear a low murmur coming from somewhere beneath your feet. One mainstream fact about medieval Iceland: burial mounds were common resting places for chieftains, warriors, and everyday folk alike. Unlike neat churchyards in mainland Europe, these mounds often sat alone on hillsides or fields, visible reminders that the past never lay too far away. People believed the dead guarded their graves fiercely, sometimes even their worldly goods buried with them. Your fingers trail across the rough grass, covering one of these mounds. It feels oddly warm under your palm, though the wind bites cold at your cheeks. Stories say treasure is hidden beneath some of these hills: gold, rings, swords, silver brooches, with the dead to serve them in the next life. And if you dared disturb the mound, you risked waking its restless occupant. Historians still argue whether the mound-guarding ghost, called a hogbui in Old Norse, was more myth than reality, or a lingering echo of older Norse beliefs that mixed grave spirits with land guardians. Either way, the threat felt real enough to keep many a greedy hand from digging too deep. Imagine kneeling here at dusk, fingers scraping at frozen soil in hopes of striking silver. The sky overhead darkens fast, stars peeking through ragged clouds, and the wind picks up a cold sigh that might just be the voice of the mound's owner telling you, quite sternly, to mind your own business. A quirky nugget: not every burial mound ghost was a fierce warrior or chieftain. Some stories tell of farmers who rose from their graves to chase off grave robbers, clouding them upside the head with phantom fists, or worse, dragging them underground to join the treasure as an eternal guard. Imagine explaining that to your neighbors. Well, Helgi went out to dig up some old coins and didn't come home. Probably married now. To the ghost, you shift your weight, boots crunching frostbitten moss. Some mounds were said to hum or sigh when storms approached, an eerie weather forecast long before meteorologists showed up with satellite maps. A good farmer learned to listen. If the mound murmured, you lashed down the turf roof tighter and drove your sheep into the warm byre. Modern scholars still debate whether these stories were just clever ways to keep ancient burial sites undisturbed. After all, it is cheaper to scare off treasure hunters with ghost tales than to guard every grave with a hired sword. And in Iceland's vast, lonely spaces, a good story can do more than a lock and key. You circle another mound, larger than the first, its top crowned with a squat stone marker leaning slightly to the east. In the sagas, heroes sometimes broke open these mound-seeking swords with names, rings with curses, or wisdom buried with an old rival. But more than a few paid dearly for it, waking spirits who fought back with ghostly strength. A light joke for your next campfire chat: if someone brags about finding buried treasure, ask them if they vet-checked to see if it is still attached to its owner, as bony hand. Might save them a haunting later. You glance back at the low cluster of turf houses behind you, tiny humps that mirror the burial mounds ahead. In some ways, the living and dead weren't so different here. Both huddled under grass and stone, bracing against the same brutal winds, dreaming the same dark dreams under a wide, indifferent sky. You sit down on a cold stone near one mound's base, listening to the hush of the valley. The longer you sit, the more it feels like the earth itself is breathing beneath you, slow, patient, and maybe a little watchful. It's no wonder people imagine the dead whispering through the soil, reminding the living to respect the fragile line that separates flesh from memory. When you stand again, you brush dirt from your palms and murmur a quick apology just in case. Because here in Iceland's lonely hills, it never hurts to be polite to what's buried underfoot. You leave the murmuring mounds behind, boots squelching over damp turf as you follow the faint track back toward the valley's shadowed edge. The path dips near a shallow hollow where the ground feels colder somehow, like the earth here remembers too much. It's here, in this bleak little dip in the land, that you imagine the villagers once gathered to mutter about witchcraft and revenants, those restless corpses who refuse to stay put. One mainstream fact about medieval Iceland, belief in the undead, the draugr, and other restless dead, was so widespread that people developed practical folk, spells to stop a corpse from walking. It wasn't enough to bury the body deep. You had to do it right, seal the mouth with a stone, tie the big toes together, maybe even drive an iron pin through the shroud to keep the dead from wriggling free when the wind howled. You crouch near an old stone circle, half buried in moss. Some say these stones marked places where witches performed small rites to bind spirits, part pagan echo, part practical neighborhood insurance plan. After all, nothing ruins a good night's sleep like Grandpa rising from his grave because you forgot to tie the burial knots properly. Quirky tidbit: people would sometimes sprinkle magic runes or secret herbs into the grave. Angelica root, rowan berries, or even dried fish bones arranged in a certain shape. Anything that might slow a revenant down if it tried to push up through the frozen turf. Some folks believed a witch could call up the dead too, but always at a risk. Spirits are moody things, especially if they died angry or greedy. You pull your cloak tighter, imagining the hush of villagers whispering behind turf walls. Historians still argue whether these stories of corpse walkers were born from half-seen nightmares or genuine exhumations. Medieval Iceland's cold earth often preserved bodies so well that when a grave reopened, say, to move it away from a landslide, it looked for all the world like the corpse had only just paused for a nap. You picture yourself standing there, lantern flickering, staring into a hole in the ground. Eyes open, skin pale, but not quite rotted, maybe the lips parted in a grin. Is it any wonder your mind might leap to the idea that this fellow could sit up at any moment? You rise from the hollow and walk on, the path bending near a tangle of thorn bushes. Some legends claimed revenants could slip into barns or byres, crushing livestock in their stalls, or sitting heavy on sleeping villagers. To stop that, people would carve protective runes into the doorframe, or sprinkle ashes in the shape of a sunwheel across the threshold. Simple magic to hold the restless dead outside. A joke for you: if your roommate snores like the dead rising, maybe leave a bit of rowan by the pillow tonight, just in case. Can't hurt, right? Historians still pick at these stories, wondering if the whole dread of revenants was tied to the harsh winters, when livestock perished mysteriously and diseases struck without warning. A healthy farmer might drop dead in a week, and if your luck soured, people looked for something, or someone, to blame. The grave was a convenient suspect. Back then, they didn't have germ theory. They had the neighbor's uncle, who died 2 winters ago, and probably definitely cursed the cattle on his way out. If all else failed, you dug him up and tried to talk him back to sleep, so to speak. A little witchcraft, a little folk wisdom, a dash of cold terror to keep your boots moving. You pause by a crooked birch leaning over the trail. Its roots creep into the old stones of another abandoned farmstead, tiny mounds of earth where someone, once upon a time, might have burned herbs and murmured protective charms into the smoke. Maybe they worked. Or maybe the revenant just found someone else to trouble instead. You keep walking, careful not to brush against the birch's bone-white branches. After all, in a place where the dead sometimes forget to stay dead, it's good manners to step lightly. Best not to disturb what you can to see, and better still to whisper thanks to the old witch, whose charms might still be keeping these hills quiet tonight. You leave the hollow behind, boots tapping a gentle rhythm on a frozen dirt path that winds toward the edge of an ancient churchyard. In the distance, a low stone wall breaks the scrubby expanse half buried under drifted snow and crawling moss. You can just make out the crooked wooden crosses leaning at odd angles, like sentinels too tired to stand straight. Even now, with the stars blinking awake above you, this place feels restless. One mainstream fact: medieval Icelanders often built small churchyards. Near their scattered farms, tiny sanctuaries meant to fence in the dead and keep their spirits tucked safely beneath consecrated ground. But fences were flimsy things in this land of drifting snows and drifting souls. Some believed a ghost could slip through any crack if the burial rites weren't done right, or if someone forgot to lock the corpse door. Corpse door? Yes, that's your quirky fact for tonight. Many old Icelandic churches and even farmhouses had special corpse doors low, narrow openings in the walls used only for carrying out the dead. Once the body passed through, the door was sealed up tight with turf or stone. The logic? If you carried the corpse out by a different door, its spirit would get confused and forget how to come back inside to trouble the living. You might chuckle now, but in the hush of midnight, with the northern lights flickering overhead, you'd be double-checking that latch too. You step through a break in the wall, boots crunching on frost-hardened grass. The gravestones are lichen-streaked, some no more than rough boulders marking where generations of farmers, fishers, and children sleep beneath the thin soil. The wind gusts, stirring loose drifts and making the old wood gate creak like a drawn-out sigh. Historians still argue whether Iceland's practice of churchyard burials was more about adopting European Christian norms or a local twist on older Norse burial customs. Out here on the edge of the known world, Christianity arrived on saga boats and settled among trolls, spirits, and rune-carved memories. A holy fence was only ever part of the plan. The real work was done by prayers, watchful neighbors, and the folk charms tucked into every sleeve and pocket. You walk carefully between the leaning stones, eyes flicking to the shadows. They say that if you stand in a graveyard at midnight during the darkest weeks of winter, you might see the dead gather for their own church, service ghostly figures shuffling past the gate's shoulders' bent heads, low murmuring hymns no living ear could quite catch. Some families claim to see long-gone relatives join the line, nodding politely before slipping back underground at the first cockcrow. The old wooden church beside you is little more than a mossy skeleton walls sagging inward, the roof patched with turf. A single narrow window frames the pale moon, and for a moment you half expect to see a face peering out, an old priest checking to see if you remembered to bow before stepping inside. Or maybe just a trick of shadow and your tired eyes. You push open the cracked door anyway. The inside is bare. A rough plank altar, benches for maybe 20 souls, living or otherwise. Your breath fogs the stale air, and your boots creak louder than any hymn ever sung here. Imagine a tiny congregation gathered centuries ago, candles flickering against rough-hewn walls, while just outside, the dead waited patiently for their turn to speak through dreams and cold winds. A quick modern aside: some Icelanders today still step carefully around old churchyards, not because they expect revenants to come clomping out, but because the bones beneath these stones hold family history too tangled to disturb lightly. Dig here for a new foundation, and you might dig up a few old regrets while you re-add it. A light joke for your next ghost tour: if your guide says, "Stay close, we don't want to lose anyone in the graveyard," try not to glance at the stones that look just wide enough to lift their lids. Outside again, you rest your palm on the cold stone wall. Historians still wonder if these churchyards were built more for the living than the dead, a way to gather people together, share news, settle disputes, and reassure each other that fences, whether of stone or faith, might just be strong enough to hold the restless dark at bay. As you leave through the old gate, you pause, just a second, out of respect or out of that deep old twinge that says, maybe, just maybe, something is watching you walk away and kindly deciding to let you go home in peace tonight. You follow the path away from the churchyard, boots soft on frostbitten grass as the land flattens into a broad plain, dotted with lonely turf houses and the flicker of hearth fires behind thick walls. The hush of the graveyard gives way to the soft crackle of peat fires and the low murmur of voices drifting on the wind. You're heading toward the heart of Iceland's storytelling tradition now, where sagas come alive and ghost tales curl up beside you like a warm dog on a cold night. One mainstream fact: Iceland's medieval sagas are among the most vivid, detailed narrative treasures in Europe long. Winding family epics packed with feuds, magic, weather, and yes, more than a few restless spirits. Families gathered in smoky halls to recite these tales aloud, passing down not just names and bloodlines, but the echoes of who might come knocking after dark. You duck into a turf house where smoke curls up through a hole in the sod roof. Inside, the glow from the hearth paints every rough beam gold and sets shadows dancing in the corners. You lower yourself onto a sheepskin-covered bench beside the crackling fire, feeling the old boards creak under your weight. Someone's grandmother might be spinning wool at the far end, nodding along as the storyteller clears his throat. A quick, quirky fact for you. Many saga ghost stories start so matter-of-factly do you think a walking corpse was no bigger deal than a stray sheep? A typical line might go, so-and-so died and was buried, and then he got up and came to the door. That's it, no thunder, no vampire cape, just a dead uncle back for a chat about who's stealing the fish barrels. Historians still argue whether these saga ghosts were coded messages about social anxieties, neighbors stealing sheep, distant kin claiming land, or old grudges that just wouldn't lie down. When you don't have streetlights or newspapers, the ghosts stand in for all the simmering problems that might stumble through your door at dusk. The fire pops and sparks. You listen close as the storyteller leans forward, voice low and calm. He tells you of the ghost of Glamour from Grettir's saga, a shepherd who turned up dead in deep winter, buried in frozen ground that refused to keep him quiet. Soon he was roaming the hills at night, eyes glowing in moonlight, terrifying livestock and farmhands alike. Not some shadowy whisper, but a full-on menace, all muscle and frost and grave dirt. Iceland's answer to the neighborhood stray dog, if the dog could rip your roof off. You shift on your bench, feeling the warmth seep into your chilled bones. Outside, the wind rattles the turf roof, but can't quite find its way in. Maybe that's why these stories live so long. Every creak, every gust becomes a ghost's knock if you're half asleep in the dark. A little joke. Imagine Netflix back then. You need the bravest neighbor to walk miles through a snowstorm just to deliver the next episode no-skip intro. Just skip the revenant blocking your path. The storyteller throws another chunk of peat on the fire, sending a swirl of sparks toward the low ceiling. He weaves in another tale, this one of a kindly ghost who warned a farmer of an incoming avalanche. Or the poor soul whose restless spirit flickered as a pale light near the barn until the family paid a forgotten debt. Even the kind ones needed something in apology, a prayer, or a cup of milk left on the doorstep. Historians still debate if these saga ghosts were cautionary tales for a tight-knit island community. Subtle reminders to settle grudges before they grew legs and crawled back at midnight. You glance around the room. Other listeners nod slowly, eyes drooping under the warm glow. The sagas don't just scare, they soothe too, wrapping you in the sense that you're never really alone, no matter how wide the winter gets or how deep the night sinks. As the tale winds down, you feel the hush settle in again. The wind softens. The storyteller's voice drops to a whisper, the last lines drifting into the crackle of the fire. And somewhere beyond the walls, under snow and stone, the ghosts settle to content, for now, to let you drift deeper into sleep, your dreams stitched with sagas spun by firelight. You leave the warmth of the turf house behind, pushing through the heavy door and stepping back into the hush of the Icelandic night. The wind greets you with a cold kiss, brushing away the last hints of peat smoke that clung to your clothes. Overhead, the sky glimmers with faint northern lights' wispy green ribbons, drifting across a darkness so vast it almost hums. You walk slowly now, boots crunching across thin frost that glitters under your steps. In the distance, a faint line of lights marks another small cluster of homes, another family huddled together, whispering tales of the dead to keep the silence from swallowing them whole. One mainstream fact: medieval Icelanders believed the restless dead could drift into everyday life through dreams, farm chores, or oddly enough through livestock. A sudden sickness in a prized cow, a horse that refused to enter its stall, or chickens that wouldn't lay sometimes, the living blamed the lingering dead. You pause near a low paddock fence, leaning on the weathered timber. The sheep beyond stir softly, the bells at their necks giving off muffled chimes in the dark. Out here, every sound matters. A strange bleat, a footstep where there shouldn't be. One of these tiny signs might be the only warning that something has come back. A quirky twist for you: some old folk believed that the dead could ride animals at night, mounting invisible horses or sheep to roam the valleys faster than any living rider could chase them. Some farmers left scraps of hay out near the byre door so the ghost wouldn't steal a living horse for its midnight wanderings. Historians still argue whether these stories were born of real livestock mischief, foxes spooking flocks, wolves prowling the edges of farms, or whether the ghostly rider was a tidy excuse for a lost foal or a mysteriously trampled fence. Maybe it was just easier to say, "The dead did it," than to accept how harsh the wilderness could be. You step closer to the fence. One sheep lifts its head, steam drifting from its muzzle. Its eyes catch the moonlight, just right, tiny, mirrored coins staring through you. For a heartbeat, you wonder if it's really looking at you, or past you, at something that only sheep and ghosts can see. You shake off the shiver creeping up your neck. After all, you're just a traveler here, an eavesdropper in a land where the line between grave and doorstep feels as thin as the skin on milk. A light joke for your next farm visit: if your hostess horse refuses to cross a certain bridge at night, maybe offer it a polite word. After all, you never know which saddle might still have an old ghost's name stitched under the leather. The wind rattles a loose shutter on the nearby barn. It creaks once, twice like a knuckle cracking in the dark. You step away from the fence and follow the path around the barn's side, your boots brushing dry grass that crunches like old parchment. Historians still puzzle over how these ghostly farm tales shaped Iceland's relationship with its animals. Here, sheep and horses weren't just property, they were partners in survival, protectors of warmth and meat when winter closed in. Small wonder the dead might cling to them too, refusing to leave the only warmth they'd ever known. You duck your head into the open barn door. The smell hits you: sweet hay, old wool, a faint tang of manure. Cozy, really, compared to the frost outside. For centuries, families slept just a thin wall away from their animals, sharing body heat when the winds howled. If a ghost slipped inside, it found company: bleating sheep, the slow, trusting breath of a good horse, the steady hum of the living pressing close against the dark. You step back out under the stars, breath misting in the cold air. Somewhere behind you, a sheep coughs softly. Just an animal, you tell yourself. Just an animal in a place where the dead ride borrowed backs, drifting from valley to valley until the sun returns. You pull your cloak tighter and move on, the fence fading behind you as you follow the path toward the next story, waiting in the hush of the Icelandic night. You carry on down the winding path, boots brushing through brittle grass that rattles softly in the midnight breeze. The distant sheepfold fades behind you, replaced by the rise and fall of the land-rolling mounds that look innocent, enough by day, but wear a different face under moonlight. Here, in this hush of frost and shadow, you find another old fear woven into the Icelandic night: the corpse lights. One mainstream fact: medieval Icelanders, like many northern folk, believed in ghostly lights called draugabjörd corpse lights that flickered over graves, bogs, or lonely crossroads. These pale, wandering flames were said to mark the place where restless dead drifted above the ground, still clinging to whatever unfinished business bound them tight to the living world. You pause where the trail crosses a patch of soggy ground. A faint mist curls from the earth, catching moonlight like silver smoke. Imagine standing here centuries ago. No flashlight, no phone, just your own shivering breath and the sudden flare of a cold blue flame bobbing across the bog. Would you follow it, hoping for hidden treasure? Or would you run the other way, boots sliding through mud, prayers spilling from your lips faster than your breath? Quirky tidbit. Some Icelanders claimed these corpse lights could be helpful. If you were brave enough to follow one, it might guide you to a buried body that needed a proper Christian grave, or lead you to a lost item the dead couldn't bear to let go. But there was a catch: ignore the light, or laugh at it, and it might follow you home instead. And once a ghost's light finds your doorstep, good luck sleeping through the night. Historians still argue whether these flickering tailies were inspired by real swamp gas methane bubbling up from soggy turf, or whether the lights were just the mind's trick when eyes strain too hard to find shapes in the dark. Whatever the truth, corpse lights flicker through saga after saga, bobbing ahead of travelers too stubborn or curious to turn back. You step around a shallow puddle, the mud soft under your heel. A breeze stirs the mist, and for a heartbeat, you almost see it, a pale wisp hovering low, drifting away when you lean closer. Maybe it's just the moon tangled in fog, or maybe it has a ghost's gentle suggestion. Not all lost things want to be found. In old times, villagers who saw corpse lights might gather by daylight to mark the spot with a stone or small cairn, just in case. Sometimes they dig hoping to find the bones of someone never given a proper grave. Other times, they'd mutter a prayer and walk away slowly, careful not to anger whatever lingered underneath. You glance behind you, just to be sure nothing's drifting in your wake. The path winds on, edged with frost-crusted grass that glows faintly in the starlight. Far ahead, you catch a glimpse of an old cairn, a rough stack of stones that's been there so long the moss is older than most villages. A light joke to tuck in your pocket. If someone tells you they see a strange light bobbing near the bog, maybe offer them a lantern. Better yet, offer to hold the door while they go first. Icelandic courtesy, you know. Historians still puzzle over why people in these frozen valleys needed corpse lights at all. Maybe it was the island's taste for hidden places. Caves, bogs, lonely hillocks where the living feared to tread, but the dead could drift freely. Or maybe it was just a way to explain those odd flickers in the corner of your eye when your mind is half asleep, but your fear is wide awake. You rest your hand on the old cairn when you reach it, the stone damp and cold under your palm. For a heartbeat, you think you feel a hum-nothing you'd swear to, of course. Just a tiny reminder that the land here is stitched together with stories, each one flickering up through the soil like a flame no wind can quite blow out. You breathe in the cold air, taste the peat and salt of the island, and move on step at a time, leaving the corpse lights to drift behind you, waiting for the next dreamer bold enough to follow their glow into the fog. You push on, boots sinking slightly, where the frost hasn't hardened the ground. Behind you, the corpse lights fade back into the hush of the bog, leaving only the crackle of your breath and the low whisper of wind threading through stiff grasses. Ahead, a low rise breaks the horizon, a knoll, crowned with the splintered remains of an ancient homestead. It is here you find the next uneasy layer in Iceland's ghostly patchwork, the revenge hunters. One mainstream fact: the medieval Icelandic sagas are full of tales where the dead refused to rest until some feud was settled, some slight avenged, some blood price paid in full. Iceland as old legal system based more on honor and memory than on sturdy. Jails left grudges simmering like slow coals under snow. And sometimes, when the living dragged their feet, the dead stepped in to finish the argument. You climbed the knoll, boots scraping stone, that once formed walls thick enough to turn back a winter storm. What's left now is just a scatter of mossy turf, a few whalebone posts leaning like old men in a windstorm, and maybe, if you stand very still, the faint echo of a voice that hasn't forgiven you yet. A quirky twist for you. In some stories, the vengeful dead didn't wait for their killer to die and join them. Instead, they rose right out of the ground, stomped across farmyards, and knocked politely or not at the door. One saga tells of a man murdered for cheating at games. He refused burial until his killer confessed. His body just kept showing up at the threshold, grave dirt still clinging to his boots. Historians still argue whether these revenant feuds were just a way to scare stubborn neighbors into paying debts, or whether they sprang from a deep fear that a single unresolved insult could poison a whole valley for generations. When the law was as fragile as frost on a warm day, sometimes only the threat of a ghost could keep folk honest. You run your fingers across a rough patch of old turf wall. Cold seeps through your gloves, grounding you in this place where people once slept with knives under their pillows, not always to guard against the living. Some families whispered that if your ancestors rose for revenge, you'd better be ready to stand aside and let them pass through your door unhindered. Slamming the door on a ghost bent on payback? Bad idea. A modern aside, Iceland's famously low crime rate today might have less to do with surveillance cameras and more to do with the fact that, deep down, people still half wonder if Grandma's watching. It is easier to stay honest when you believe the consequences might crawl out of the ground at dusk. A light joke for your next polite argument. If someone swears they'll haunt you forever, check their family tree first. If they're Icelandic, they just might mean it. You circle the knoll, picking your way through patches of frostbitten heather. A sudden gust rattles a half-buried fence, post once the corner of a pen for sheep or cattle, now just another ghost handle sticking out of the earth. You can almost see a long-ago farmer muttering here, watching the wind tear at his turf walls, wondering if tonight might be the night some old enemy came knocking from under the ground. Historians still puzzle over how much these revenge hunters shaped daily life. Did the threat of a restless spirit keep feuds in check better than any sheriff could? Maybe. Or maybe these stories just gave restless neighbors something to believe in when the northern dark pressed close and grudges outlived their owners. You stand a moment longer, listening for anything beneath the hum of the wind. Just the rustle of frost in the grass, the soft hiss of your own breath. No footsteps climbing the knoll behind you yet. Maybe that's enough for tonight. You step down from the ruined homestead, boots sinking once more into soft turf. Behind you, the hill settles back into its patient sleep grudges, wrapped tight in the frozen earth, waiting for the day someone forgets how deep Iceland's memories run. You pick your way down from the knoll, breath puffing in small white clouds that drift ahead of you like your own tiny troop of ghost lights. The path flattens where the valley widens, the wind softening to a low hum around your ears. Here, the land opens to scattered farms, little specks of warmth and firelight, strung out like beads on a crooked thread. You're stepping into another layer of this old, restless lore, the peculiar folk charms and home rituals meant to keep Iceland's ghosts at bay. One mainstream fact: in medieval Iceland, everyday folk were experts at weaving a bit of pagan survival into Christian belief. Church prayers covered the soul, but for everything else, stray spirits, night terrors, missing sheep-ewe turned to charms, runes, and whispered verses passed from grandmother to granddaughter. You stop by a half-fallen turf wall, its stones slick with frost. Imagine ducking through a low doorway into a tiny cottage where someone as mother or aunt mutters over a bundle of herbs, tying them with sheep-gut string. She hangs the charm over the door or slips it under a baby's pillow, all to keep some half-forgotten ancestor from lingering too close to the cradle. A quirky tidbit: Icelandic households sometimes carved protective staves, called galdrastafur, into door beams or furniture. These runic symbols could turn aside all sorts of trouble-ill wishes from a neighbor, wandering ghosts, even the evil eye. One of the most famous is the gishulmur, or helm of awe-spiky circle of intersecting lines, meant to terrify enemies and spirits alike. You'd scratch it into a bit of driftwood, or paint it on your forehead before battle, or before a risky sheep raid. Same principle, really. Historians still argue whether these symbols were mostly folk art, wishful thinking, or fragments of a much older magical tradition that never quite died out. In Iceland, the line between everyday belief and proper religion was always slippery, like frost on a turf roof. You brush your glove against the frozen wall. Under your palm, you picture these symbols' lines crossing like roads on a map, each stroke holding back something hungry in the dark. In these valleys, every family had its own stash of secrets. Verses mumbled at dawn, herbs buried at crossroads, a scrap of cloth knotted 9 times to trap a nightmare before it slipped back through the rafters. A light joke for the modern world: if your Wi-Fi keeps dropping at 3 a.m., maybe scratch a quick helm of awe onto your router. If nothing else, you'll feel marginally braver while you wait for the connection to come back. You step through where the old turf wall crumbles into a patch of brush. Somewhere nearby you imagine a cottage's low glow, a lone candle flickering in the window while a farmer hums under his breath. Maybe he's carving a new stave for the doorframe tonight. Maybe his wife is sprinkling dried angelica under the bed, one last line of defense against any relative with unfinished business. Historians still sift through these charms and sagas, wondering how seriously people took it all. Did they truly believe an inked rune could stop a ghost in its tracks? Or was it just the comfort of doing something anything when the wind howled and the animals shifted nervously in the dark? You reach an old gate, its wood weathered and warped, but still standing. You picture a farmer touching the stave carved into its lintel every time he passes through, just a habit now. But once a promise that what belonged inside would stay safe from whatever prowled the frozen moors. You lift the latch and step through, leaving the broken wall behind. The wind sighs around you, carrying the faint smell of peat smoke and sheep wool. Ahead, the small specks of farmhouse windows promise warmth stories murmured by the hearth, charms tucked under pillows, and the quiet, practical faith that a few scratched lines or a whispered word might hold the dark at arm's length, just long enough for sleep to come. You close the old gate behind you with a soft click, boots tapping along a narrow path that weaves through the scattered farmsteads. Each low turf house looks the same at first hunched under thick sod roofs, windows dim with tallow candlelight, smoke trailing from a single peat chimney. But if you listen close, each one hums with its own old stories-tales of the living doing small, practical things to keep their ghostly neighbors at bay. One mainstream fact: in medieval Iceland, hospitality wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. Harsh weather and long distances meant that strangers often stumbled to a farm door at night, half frozen, hoping for food and warmth. Turning them away could spark a feud. Worse still, some believed that refusing a weary traveler might invite a ghostly knock at your own door later, when you least expected it. You approach a doorway, stooping under the low lintel, as if stepping into one of those warm, sheep-smelling rooms. Inside, you imagine a family crowded onto benches near the hearth. A cauldron bubbles gently. Someone dips bread into broth, while a guest, a distant cousin, or a lost traveler shares stories of who died where and whether they stayed put. A quirky tidbit: old folk wisdom claimed that some strangers might be ghosts in disguise, testing your manners. A visitor who didn't eat, who stayed oddly silent, who left no footprints in the snow better hope, you offered them a seat and a cup of warm whey. Otherwise, you might find your milk curdling and your sheep wandering off come dawn. Historians still argue whether these tales were cautionary moral lessons or real folk memories stitched into daily life. When you live on a windswept rock or survival hinges on your neighbor's goodwill, ghosts and gossip walk hand in hand. A slighted spirit and a slighted neighbor both hold grudges that can outlast winter. You settle onto an imaginary bench, your boots drying by the hearth. Someone passes you a bowl-rich lamb broth, thick with root vegetables. The steam curls into your nose, carrying the scent of warmth and trust. It's here, in these close rooms, that gossip about hauntings becomes both a pastime and a neighborhood safety net. Did you hear? Someone whispers near your shoulder. Helga's second cousin says she heard scratching in the roof again. Must be her grandfather. He still wants his hammer buried with him properly. A shrug, a sip of broth, another story flickers to life. A light joke for you to tuck away. If you ever drop by an Icelandic farm and your host hands you a steaming bowl but never takes a sip themselves, maybe check their feet for footprints on the floor. And if you find none, well, you've got a ghost story of your own now. Historians still puzzle over the blurred line between ghost gossip and neighborly meddling. Complaints about wandering dead often doubled as coded reminders. Pay your debts, fix your fences, bury your grudges deep before someone's spirit comes knocking at midnight to finish what you left undone. You set your empty bowl aside and listen to the hush after the last spoon scrapes the bottom. A baby whimpers under wool blankets. An old woman snores by the far wall. Someone murmurs a protective verse, just loud enough for the shadows to hear. For a moment, all feels sealed tight alive and safe behind thick turf and carved charms. But you know that beyond these warm walls, the wind is still out there. The graves on the hills, the corpse lights flickering in the bogs, the old feuds sleeping under mounds of frost, all of them waiting, patient as ever, for the door to creak open again. You thank your invisible host, stand up, and step back through the low door into the crisp night air. The farmstead glows softly behind you, the hum of quiet voices fading as you walk away, boots muffled by thin layers of snow that drift lazily across the path. You breathe in deep the clean bite of frost, the distant tang of sheep and peat, and keep walking, carrying the warmth of one small room with you into the restless dark. You leave the warmth of the farm behind, your footsteps swallowed by the hush that settles over the valley like a thick wool blanket. Ahead, the path winds toward a stony ridge-bare rock jutting out from the earth like a row of broken teeth. It's here, among these jagged outcrops and shadowed hollows, that Iceland's ghost stories find one of their oldest roots, the hidden people and shape-shifting spirits that drift between the living and the dead. One mainstream fact, medieval Icelandic belief didn't draw neat lines between ghosts and other unseen beings. Elves, land spirits, trolls, even the sly Huldafolk, the hidden folk, could drift through walls and mines, blurring into the same half-lit realm as the restless dead. If your sheep vanished, your firewood spoiled, or your dreams turned strange, there was always a whisper that maybe it wasn't just a neighbor's grudge, but something older, something not quite human at all. You pause by a cleft in the ridge where frost feathers cling to the stone like lace. In these shadowed cracks, people once left small offerings. A splash of milk, a twist of butter, a bit of bread. Anything to keep the hidden folk content, because once annoyed, they could sour your cows, sicken your horses, or twist your dreams into restless nights where the dead walked and the living tossed and turned. A quirky tidbit for you. Some old tailies claimed the hidden people could lend you their shape if you crossed in the right way or the wrong way. A wandering spirit might cloak itself in a human form, slip inside a neighbor's skin for a night, then drift back into the rock at dawn. Is it a ghost? An elf? Both? In Iceland, labels didn't matter half as much as staying on the right side of whatever watched from the shadows. Historians still argue whether these stories of hidden folk and ghosts were ways to explain the wildness of a landscape that never quite bent to human will. Farming here was hard enough without mysterious rock dwellers messing up your hayfield, or half-visible shadows haunting your cowshed. Maybe these tales were a way to blame bad luck on anyone when the wind tore your roof off for the third time that winter. You step closer to the cleft, peering into its narrow throat where moonlight barely reaches. If you listen, you almost hear a trickle of snowmelt, a faint echo of something shifting deeper in the stone. Or maybe it's just your breath, weaving stories out of shadows like every Icelander before you. A light joke to carry back to your own doorstep. If your keys go missing tonight, don't blame your neighbor. Maybe thank the hidden folk and leave a splash of milk by the fridge. Can't hurt, can it? You run your hand along the cold rock, tracing the moss and frost. Centuries ago, families marked certain stones as elf hills or spirit rocks, places never to be moved or broken apart. Some roads still bend strangely around big boulders better, a long detour than the risk of stirring up something that might follow you home. Knock politely at midnight, then settle in for a few decades. Historians still puzzle over how these shape-shifting spirits and ghost beliefs overlapped. Maybe it was just how isolation worked here. When you spend long winters listening to wind and watching shadows crawl across the snow, your mind stitches everything together: sagas, spirits, the hidden folk into one restless tapestry that hums under your floorboards and behind your barn. You step away from the cleft, boots crunching softly as you crest the ridge. The land opens wide below fields brushed with frost, tiny farm lights flickering like hearth coals in the dark. Somewhere among them, a child stirs in sleep. An old woman mumbles a charm under her breath, and a patch of stone glows faintly where someone left an offering, just to be sure the night stays quiet. You draw your cloak tighter, breath slow and misting in the moonlight. Then you keep walking, leaving the ridge and its hidden watchers behind, for now your boots carrying you deeper into the hush where the living, the dead, and the hidden all drift together in the soft fold of Iceland's longest nights. You descend from the ridge, your boots crunching down into softer ground where the frost gives way to patches of bare peat and bristly grass. Each step feels slower now, your legs heavy, your breath a quiet rhythm in the dark. The small lights of scattered farms flicker behind you, swallowed one by one as you follow the winding trail toward the edge of the village, where the last stories linger like faint embers waiting to be stirred. One mainstream fact: by the late medieval period, Iceland's ghost stories had begun to weave themselves into church sermons and law codes. Bishops condemned certain hauntings as superstition, while slyly folding others into warnings about sin, pride, or revenge. The line between pagan dread and Christian caution blurred, and the dead, those wandering souls and vengeful shades, found new life in pulpits and parish records. You pause by a half-collapsed wooden cross marking the spot where an old chapel once stood. Only the wind prays here now, combing through the rough grass and whispering across the stones. If you close your eyes, you might almost hear a distant bell, someone's memory of a Sunday long faded, when the living and the dead sat together under a low sod roof, listening for promises that the restless might finally rest. A quirky detail: in some remote valleys, people kept a small corpse path, a shortcut only used for funerals. To walk it on any other day was to invite mischief or worse. Stray off the village road onto that narrow line of packed earth, and you risked stepping into a procession of the dead, forever doomed to follow your footprints back to your doorstep. Historians still argue whether these corpse paths were practical, an easy route from homestead to graveyard, or a woven charm in dirt and grass, guiding the dead one last time so they wouldn't wander back through unlocked doors and half-latched windows. In a place where you lived shoulder to shoulder with your ancestors, boundaries mattered, even if they were only a line of trampled snow. You shift your weight, feeling the earth soften beneath your boots. Farther down this hidden track, the shadows grow deeper. No more turf houses, no friendly flicker of candlelight, just the hush of old wind and the hush of old bones, both settled under the same thin layer of soil. A small joke to keep your courage steady. If someone invites you for a midnight stroll down a path that only ghosts walk, maybe ask for a rain check. Or better yet, bring extra mittens. If the dead tug at your sleeve, at least your hands will be warm. You walk on, the path winding past low stones that might be grave markers, or just the bones of the land pushing through the frost. The wind sighs, stirring the last dry reeds beside a half-frozen brook. Somewhere behind you, the lights of the living flicker like a memory you can slip into your pocket-small warmth against the weight of so much dark. Historians still wonder what these ghost stories gave Icelanders beyond a shiver. Maybe they were reminders that what we bury doesn't stay buried. Not always. Old grudges, old debts, old kindnesses, they drift behind us like footsteps in snow, waiting for someone to turn and listen. You pause where the path fades into rough scrub, the last sign of the village flickering on the horizon. Behind you, the ghosts settle back into their hills and hollows. Their lights flicker out over bogs. Their cold fingers slip from door latches and dream corners. For now, you take one last breath of frost and peat and ancient hush. Then you let it out slow, your boots still, your shoulders loosening as the night opens wide around you, huge and soft and oddly kind. And now, at the edge of all these murmurs and drifting tailies, it's time to let the final flickers fade. You stand there a moment longer, feeling the land breathe under your feet. The wind softens to a whisper, tugging gently at your coat, smoothing out the last edges of the story you've carried through frost and flickering lights. The ghosts slip back into their earthbound beds, curling beneath stone and turf, their old grudges folded into the hush like forgotten dreams. You let your eyes close for a heartbeat, just enough to feel how big the night is, how small your footsteps sound in the snow. There is no door to lock behind you here, no charms to tuck under your pillow tonight. The tailies have done their work. They've tugged at your fear, stirred a grin, whispered reminders that every hearth fire has its shadows, and every shadow is softer once named. Above you, the northern sky unfurls in quiet green ripples, a sleepy veil that drifts between worlds. You feel your shoulders drop, your breath slow, your mind settle into the rhythm of the land itself, old, forgiving, half-dreaming. Whatever haunts you tonight, small worries, stubborn thoughts, half-finished lists, they all drift out like breath in the frost. You stand here one last moment, listening to how silent it is when the past lies down beside you, more friend than threat. Then you step back into your own warm room, whatever shape that takes carrying with you, only the gentlest. Rustle of old stories humming in your bones. Sleep well now. The ghosts are quiet, the wind is kind, and the dark for once holds nothing but rest.